So we have a truly transatlantic episode of The President's Path this week because Brent and I are in DC, but Sumi, you're in London.
I am. I'm at the wonderful, big, beautiful new broadcasting house in central London. And I actually hadn't been here in 2 years. So just great to come back here and see all of our colleagues on this end and record from this end. I'm in a really fancy, cool radio studio, and I'm going to come back to DC and insist that we get something very similar.
Because we are one big, beautiful BBC after all. Well, there is, I will say, not to talk about the weather, but there is properly British or Irish weather here today, hence the frizzy hair that I have, because it's really cold and raining for heading towards the end of May. Not the kind of weather that we'd be used to. More weather that would be normal in London at this time of year. But weather aside, it's been quite stormy around the White House this week. Another spectacular day. I mean, we use these words spectacular, extraordinary, unusual, unprecedented so often, and it feels like the bar just keeps rising higher and higher.
I thought the meeting with South African President Cyril Ramaphosa was probably kind of the most explosive, one of the, if not the most explosive day we've seen at the White House so far. Just the tone of it and the obvious kind of pre-planning was, I thought, just kind of spectacular television and a very awkward moment for the world's cameras to be in front of.
And it just adds to this panoply of world leaders visiting and entering the Oval Office, kind of enter at your own peril, because you never really know what's going to happen in these meetings. And I remember when the Canadian Prime Minister came, and so many of the Canadian diplomats or former diplomats we spoke to said, we just hope he doesn't get Zelensky'd. Looking back to that really dramatic encounter that the Ukrainian president had, this really has become kind of a standard and a test for world leaders when they come to sit with Donald Trump in the Oval Office. But truly spectacular, again, a word we're using quite a bit, to see an entire show, a video, actual pieces of what Donald Trump said was evidence of claims that he and his administration are making about the persecution, as they say, of white farmers in South Africa. I mean, and Katrina, I know, you guys talked about this on your program as well. For the South Africans, they see it as their leader, Cyril Ramaphosa, as having performed pretty well, having come out of this pretty well.
Yeah, after that event in the Oval Office, I went back through some of the South African media in the run-up to the visit, how they were discussing what the visit would entail, how the president should perform. And there were many commentators in South Africa who kind of presaged this in a way. It was like, this is not going to be the hugs and kisses that, some have got, Macron, Starmer maybe, that this is going to be hostile was the word that was used often. And I guess that was, a good estimation given what Donald Trump had said on the campaign trail, what President Trump has said since coming into office, and obviously that decision to grant refugee status to Afrikaners. So the South African side were prepared for this. Could they have been prepared for the television spectacle, I suppose, that we saw? I mean, I was reading the pool notices that we get from the journalists, a small number of journalists who are in these special events. And the first one about the meeting said, there are video screens in the Oval Office. And Bernd, there aren't usually video screens in the Oval Office. Sure, there aren't.
No, there aren't. And actually, just maybe 20 minutes before he arrived, we saw them wheeling two large TV screens outside in the drizzling rain, kind of past the reporters there, but it was too crowded, so they had to find another way around. Now, at the time, it wasn't really clear what that was for, but I mean, it just shows the level of planning here. I think, even the South Africans, as you said, many in the media even kind of use the word ambush ahead of time. I don't think there's really any way to prepare for that, but he did handle it with a lot of diplomacy, I thought. And I made the point after the meeting that I think they will have thought it could have gone a lot worse. I mean, he could have been in a yelling match with President Trump in the Oval Office, not dissimilar from what we saw with Zelensky, which I think is kind of the worst case scenario. I mean, he's not a man who takes kind of public criticism lightly, as we saw with Zelensky.
it just made me also think quite a bit about how world leaders and their delegations are preparing for these type of Oval Office meetings. Clearly any one of these types of meetings, whether it was President Biden or now President Trump, is well prepared. They have an agenda of items they'll go through, some of the thornier and stickier topics. But this is a completely different type of preparation, isn't it? The fact that you saw the South African president bring famous golfers with him, knowing that that's something that would appeal to Donald Trump. The fact that he brought his agriculture minister, knowing that this question of farmers' persecution, white farmers' persecution, in the Trump administration's words, would be one of the topics on the agenda. And so there's this kind of mitigating factor that you're seeing in how these meetings are being prepared. And I know, speaking to some of the German colleagues of mine on that end, as they have a new chancellor, there's always this calculation, now of, okay, what is that first meeting going to be like? What type of business delegation do you bring with you? Who are the representatives in that office? And as we saw with that Zelensky meeting, do you use a translator? Now, obviously, that's not an issue for the South African president, but for other visiting world leaders can be. And so all of that just is a different calculus to how things previously have been run in the White House.
And I think we know from the meeting with President Ramaphosa now for sure that on the Trump administration side, they are gaming out how these meetings will go. I mean, there had been a suggestion with Zelensky. Did that just kind of happen naturally, or had that been planned? Had there been specific things each person was going to say, the vice president, the president, and so on, to kind of kick things off? But with video screens, with the vice president then taking out from behind the couch a large pile of printouts of articles and presenting those to the president for the president then to hand to President Ramaphosa. I mean, clearly that was all really planned, that they were going to do that and that they were going to do it in front of the world's media. But what was really interesting for, I think, all of us or anyone who watches international relations and foreign policy was we got to see diplomacy happen in real time before our eyes. It was a tale of two meetings in a way, I thought. Very antagonistic at the start, dim the lights, turn on the video. And then the South African delegation responded to those claims, explained they're not members of government, they're opposition. The agriculture minister referring to them as rebels repeatedly and saying, if you don't help us, this is what we will see in our parliament, but they are not in government. Really kind of fact-checking in real time the claims that had been put to them. And you felt by the end of the meeting, having heard from all of the South African delegation, that perhaps the American side had taken some of that on board, as they would in meetings that happen behind closed doors.
And I think that has to be the assumption going forward for foreign leaders, that anything that in the past administrations might have happened purely behind closed doors, away from the media. Now one must assume that you'll have that discussion there in the Oval Office with everyone around the world watching, which is such a kind of a marked change from the way things have been done in the past. But one could make an argument that it's kind of an experiment in open democracy, and that now people get to see how these how the sausage is made, essentially, which is different. And I think people kind of appreciate that. And Trump, the administration, always refers to themselves as the most transparent in
Yeah.
American history. And I think they'll point to something like yesterday's meeting or even the Zelensky meeting as this is how things are. Here, have a look.
Yeah, and certainly, that's going to be something that will be interesting to watch with any further meetings that we have with world leaders coming into the White House. But it's fascinating for us as journalists, isn't it? Because we've talked a lot about the fact that we've gotten such access as journalists and as the viewing public on a whole to this president. That certainly wasn't the case with President Biden. Bernie, you're at the White House regularly and get to ask questions to the president, even in these situations with foreign leaders on hand. What I am going to be really interested to see is what happens when the turf or the background to where these meetings take place changes. For example, we're expecting President Trump to go to the G7 in Canada in June. And we remember from his first term that there were some really interesting diplomatic incidents during some of those meetings that President Trump had with other world leaders. And this is going to be an example of where you will have the leaders of US allies together in Canada in a different setting where President Trump doesn't necessarily hold court. I mean, Canada is holding the presidency of the G7 and will be more or less, dictating the opening of it. And so it's a different setting for President Trump. He does still command a room, of course, so that won't change. But how does that calculus on diplomacy happening before our eyes change as well when it's no longer in the Oval Office in the way that the Trump administration has now set out to have these types of meetings?
I think going forward, we'd also see kind of a reluctance in that the G7 or the trip to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, for example, are kind of anomalies in that, he would much, much rather have these meetings on home turf where, the White House essentially is free to pick the media that's in the room, for example. It's not necessarily a free forum. Although so far there's been reporters in there that they know are on side, but also there's a mix of reporters. But I think in a foreign situation, it becomes much more volatile in that they really have very little control over the event. I mean, the State Department, for example, will have input into how the events are set up, but ultimately it's not just them. As opposed to here, where they really control every aspect of what happens in the room, what can be shown in the room, who's there, who can ask questions, etc.
And I think that's the key point. I mean, I heard a few people referring to this week's events as, how it was staged or theatre,
Mm-hmm.
because it very much felt like you were looking in on a stage show or a play or a TV scene unfolding before your eyes. We saw when he went to the Middle East, he treated the leaders there in a very different way
Yeah.
than he treated President Ramaphosa or President Zelensky, or indeed, Macron, Starmer, any of the others that have come through where there have been points of conflict and the individuals sitting beside him have pushed back on occasion. When he was in the Middle East, it was all, I mean, we were talking about it, the bromance, oh, you're the best, no, you're the best, no, you're the biggest, no, you're the greatest, you're the most fantastic. Look at these marble hallways. And, it's a very different interaction and a very different sort of President Trump that we see in a way because he isn't in control. So I think when he goes to the G7, it will be the same. He's like on that world stage, standing beside people who at that event have equal billing to him. And he can't, manifest, oh, you bring out all those pages and you wheel out a TV screen. Like that's just not going to be able to happen. Sure, he might hold his own press conference, in a ballroom that's for the US media and whatever, and he can be in control of that. But otherwise, I think we'll be back in those occasions. You're kind of watching the body language and who does and doesn't shake hands and what is or isn't said. And a lot of that interaction, I mean, we're still just less than a month away from the G7. Anything could happen
Yeah.
in that time. We could have a Russia-Ukraine deal. We could have something happening in Gaza. There's definitely a buildup of pressure there this week as well. It feels like the tide is starting to turn with the international community really putting pressure on the US about the dire, dire, dire humanitarian situation there. And we've heard President Trump use the word starvation a few times, which we hadn't heard from him before.
Yeah, and we've seen, of course, some of the US's allies really ramping up pressure on Israel itself to allow a full-scale aid into the territory, a really horrific situation, as you've seen the 78-day blockade and now a trickle of aid coming in. And you're seeing countries like the UK, France, Canada coming together to say there will be consequences if there's not a full-scale resumption of aid into the territory, and a number of other countries signing on. You do see a bit of a split, though, in how the US, yes, is changing its tone and some of the messaging vis-a-vis Israel on the resumption of aid into the territory, but not the same strength of tone that you've seen from the US's allies here in Europe.
I think the other big example there is talks with Iran in terms of
Yeah.
their nuclear program and enrichment, in which you're kind of seeing the U.S. and Israel kind of take slightly different approaches. I mean, the U.S. now, by the time this is broadcast, there'll have been some talks in Rome between the U.S. and Iran, and now there's a lot of reporting that suggests that the Israelis don't see that necessarily as a good thing, and that there's concern in the U.S. intelligence community that they might strike out on their own, which shows that those two positions of those two countries aren't as uniform and parallel as one might have assumed in the past. So I think we're seeing kind of it's interesting because unlike the meetings with the South Africans or Ukraine, we're seeing very little of that in public, the discussions that are happening behind the doors, behind closed doors with Israel and the US. But we are seeing at least what appears to be signs of a little bit of friction, which is, Trump has traditionally been a very enthusiastic supporter of Israel.
Bernd, when you're talking about friction, it occurred to me again this week the relationship between President Trump and the White House media, or the media in general, really seems to have deteriorated again. I mean, that clash in the Oval Office with President Ramaphosa, if that had not been so serious, we would have all been talking about the way he was speaking to the media on that occasion, how critical he was, singling out individuals who were just doing their job and asking questions, but they weren't the questions that he liked.
And I think a day or two before the Oval Office meeting with Ramaphosa, there was another incident on Capitol Hill where President Trump had been to kind of encourage Republicans to fall in line as far as the budget bill. He told a young reporter there, he wasn't familiar with the news outlet, so he said, get a real job. What a question that was. Which I think it shows just kind of the perception of some of the media in the White House. And I think that's been made a little worse recently by, revelations that we now know that perhaps some American media outlets, which the White House is very explicit about, they think they missed quite a lot in terms of Biden's ability to be president in the past. And I think that's kind of turned the White House, I mean, it's turned it up a notch now that that's in the public sphere, and that some American journalists are even acknowledging that perhaps they could have asked a little harder questions or looked into this a little more at the time. The White House is very cognizant of that, so they kind of see many of the American networks and media as having failed for 4 years, and that kind of colors their entire perception of them.
And I think what has sharpened that a bit as well is the fact that you have now the White House holding these separate MAGA influencer briefings, where you have, a briefing that's essentially open to only Trump-friendly media, and the types of questions, of course, that you get in those types of briefings are very different than the more critical questions that you might get from the White House press corps. It's fascinating to watch the way that we've seen some of those influencers, podcast hosts, which we know were really influential in helping Donald Trump get elected. Obviously, he was able to reach out to so many more of his voters through some of these big name podcasts. But as they've been invited and also incorporated into the White House press corps, I mean, I'm wondering, Bernie, when you're sitting in that press briefing room, how has that changed the dynamic? I mean, how has that changed the relationship between the traditional White House press corps and the press secretary, and of course the president himself?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, one thing that always stands out to me in the briefings when I'm sitting there is that, now perhaps more than in the past, the White House has people in the room that they're aware can reliably be called on to ask a question that's favorable to the president's agenda. I mean, these same journalists are very public about it, they see that as their kind of overarching mission. So it kind of changes the tone of the briefings, and sometimes quite abruptly, in which, let's say, Caroline Levitt's getting some very difficult questions about a particular agenda or policy position. She knows she can pivot to one of these people and kind of change the tone of the briefing in the middle of it, which I think is quite different from the Biden administration, where they really struggled, particularly with Israel and Gaza, for example, to kind of find questions that allowed them to make their point rather than kind of be responsive to what reporters were asking about. But at the same time, it's not, initially I would have thought there'd be a lot of tension in the briefing room between kind of the old guard, as it were, and the new media. But it's quite collegial, to be honest. I think it just really just changes the tone of the briefing itself.
And even the president commented on that this week himself, didn't he? Because we should say the White House has taken control of the pool, the press pool, we call it, which is, kind of a representative group of the media who go into small spaces like the Oval Office. You can't have, obviously, 200 journalists descending in there. But they are now in control of who's in that pool, where it used to be the White House Correspondents Association, who kind of rotated it very evenly between people. Everyone had certain duties, and you had to be able to do that, like sending the information in a certain way. You got into the pool, you shared it with everyone. But now that the White House is in control of that pool, oftentimes you'll have more journalists in those small spaces who are, let's say, friendly to President Trump, then who are impartial, or, you know, let's be honest, some American media have an anti-Trump agenda as well. But the president himself commented one day this week, he's like, oh, you guys are being so nice to me. These questions are so nice. I liked it more the other way. It was more fun that way, you know, kind of when it was more combative. So I guess you can't have it every way.
I think he kind of reveled in that back and forth as much as they like to kind of criticize some of the media and the American networks. I mean, for example, the NBC reporter who was kind of his main target during the Ramaphosa meeting, you know, he's had a history with this person, but he keeps calling on him. Ultimately, Donald Trump decides who he's calling on in those rooms. He knew exactly who he was calling on at the time. He knows him by name. They've kind of a long history. So I think he kind of, you know, as angry as he might seem, he really does enjoy that back and forth, you know, and he likes to think when he comes out on top.
Yeah, I do think it's important to note that, of course, a lot of times that when we see these combative exchanges get or escalate a bit further than we're perhaps used to seeing them escalate, we do hear often from the Trump administration or from the president himself this threat of legal action. And that's truly something that's a new wrinkle. And, you know, we saw before President Trump entered office, after he won the election, that ABC News settled a defamation lawsuit with him. CBS News, Donald Trump had sued them over the interview that they had on 60 Minutes with former Vice President Kamala Harris. It could be that they're close to settling. So, you know, as much as there might be this enjoying of this back and forth and these combative exchanges, there is something that's a bit deeper to it and a bit sharper to it than we've seen in the past. And that's something that does present a challenge to journalists who are covering the president every day and who are looking to be able to put their questions to the president every day.
And Bernie, when you're speaking of winning, we can't let this episode go by, I think, without singling out the huge win for President Trump and his followers this week with the passage through the House of Representatives of the One Big Beautiful Bill, bringing in his tax cuts, his budget reforms. We should say, of course, it still has to get through the Senate. That's not a given, but it's a massive win, isn't it?
It is, and I thought it was really telling, you know, how much effort he seemed to put into it right at the end in terms of going to Capitol Hill, for example, on the Tuesday, having some of the holdouts at the White House on the Wednesday, and, you know, most telling of all, the White House put out a statement saying they would see it as, quote unquote, the greatest betrayal if Republicans didn't pass this, which left, you know, it left it very clear to people that, you know, he would remember it if people kept continue to be in the way of getting this through. And, you know, with midterms really not that far off, I think, you know, the subtext there was very evident for everyone on the Hill, particularly, you know, House Republicans who may be running against him.
Yeah, we talked a bit about the fact that this exposed some of the ideological differences within the Republican caucus and how you had some Republicans, those fiscal hawks in the Freedom Caucus, for example, who wanted to see bigger cuts. You had those who were really skeptical about cuts to Medicare and Medicaid because of constituents in their own districts, to your point about midterms, Bernie. And we talked in a previous pod about the state and local tax deductions for some of those Democrats in those big blue states like California and New York. And in the end, it was, of course, President Trump and the work of the Speaker Johnson, to be able to bring everyone over the line.
And I think the White House, you know, assuming this does get passed and on Trump's desk, you know, they say they want to do it by the 4th of July, which is kind of a nice touch on their perspective. The White House very clearly sees this as kind of, if they can get this win, then more wins will follow. I mean, for example, with mass deportations, I mean, the bill includes, you know, the kind of the resources that Donald Trump thinks could kind of facilitate the mass deportations. So, I mean, that would be kind of a follow-on win after getting this on his desk. And I think they kind of see this as kind of crucial to be able to accomplish the things he's promised and has already kind of started in the first few months of the administration.
But we'll see what happens in the Senate. We will be talking about that, I'm sure, next week and in the weeks to follow. We are at time for today. I hope you both have one big, beautiful bank holiday weekend. It is Memorial Day weekend, a massive holiday here.
I'll be working, I promise. I'll hold down the ship.
I won't be. So.
Yeah.
Good luck to you.
We need a break.
All right, see you guys all next time.
Okay, talk soon, guys. Bye.
See you guys.
If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We'd love to hear from you, so please leave us a comment below or email us on path@bbc.co.uk.